Hello everyone, welcome to this new section. And in this section, we're going to talk about namespaces and services along with Kubernetes DNS. So we'll see what namespaces are and we'll go into the details of services. I gave a very small glimpse of these two objects in the previous sections, but I did not talk about the details. So in this section, we're going to discuss namespaces and services in details. Also, I'll introduce you to Kubernetes DNS, which is an important part of the Kubernetes cluster or the Kubernetes ecosystem. So let's proceed. The first one is namespaces. So in one of the previous videos, I had shown you an option with dash n, and I told you that it was namespace, which I would be discussing later on. So what is a namespace? In the dictionary definition, it is actually the logical grouping of Kubernetes objects within the same cluster, which means that you can have multiple groups in a same cluster. Now, what does that signify? So let's say I have this cluster and I create two namespaces. One namespace is prod and the other namespace is dev. So what would be these namespaces? These namespaces are logical grouping of objects that we create. So what are the Kubernetes objects that we have seen so far? We have seen pods, we have seen deployments, and we have seen replica sets. We have also seen a replication controller. So all these are Kubernetes objects. So using namespace, we can logically group these objects. Let's take the example of pod. Let's say we have three pods in namespace prod and another three pod in namespace dev. Now the same thing goes for deployments and replica sets also. Now why would you do that? Because we can have multiple teams, we can have multiple business. In fact, we can have multiple environments sharing the same Kubernetes cluster. So here if you see, in namespace pod, we have three pods of color red, and in namespace dev, we have three pods of color blue. Now, you might have guessed that these pods are actually the same, meaning that they are running the same application. But the difference is that they are running on separate namespaces, and in this picture, the namespace has been defined, or the namespaces have been defined based on the environments. One of them is prod and the other one is development. Similarly, you can create namespaces for any other reasons also. For example, as I said, for different teams, for different business applications, etc. And these objects do not have direct connectivity, meaning that they are isolated from each other, although the isolation is logical. Actually, we can talk to objects in another namespace from object in one namespace. So, meaning that the pod in this namespace can talk to a pod in this namespace also. But we have to do some extra work, which we'll see shortly. There's one more interesting thing, which is called resource quota. So let's take the same example. So here we have two namespaces, one is prod and the other one is dev, and both of them are on the same cluster. And of course, prod namespace would be given more importance than dev namespace. So now the cluster has limited resource only. Let's say the cluster has 50 nodes, one master, 49 workers, or 51 nodes, one master and 50 workers. And let's say each one of them has 10 GB of RAM and 2 gigahertz of CPU. In total, you have 100 gigahertz of CPU and 500 GB of RAM. So now if your application is pretty huge, of course, it'll give more CPU and RAM to prod namespace rather than dev namespace. So you can use resource quota, which is another object, to allocate certain amount of CPU and certain amount of RAM or storage or any other hardware resource to the namespace. We can create a resource quota object in such a way that prod namespace gets, let's say, 400 GB of RAM and dev namespace gets 100 GB of RAM, or prod namespace gets let's say 80 gigahertz of CPU and dev namespace gets 20 gigahertz of CPU. And the similar things can be done with other hardware resources also, like storage. So this is another information, another important thing which is provided by namespace. Apart from the logical grouping, we can allocate resources based on the importance of the objects which is there in that particular namespace. So in this case, of course, prod namespace should have more importance than dev namespace. So that's all about the theory of namespace. It's pretty straightforward, not that complicated, but some interesting thing that we're going to see now. So we already have a cluster up and running with one master and one worker. Let's see if you have any existing namespaces or not. So the first thing in the demo, we want to see if we have any existing namespaces in our cluster.